COVID vaccines are being rolled out around the world. But a determined minority are choosing to refuse them. In America, around 30% of adults are yet to take the jab. But what if the choice was taken out of their hands? Governments and companies are currently debating whether COVID-19 vaccines should become mandatory. As the debate becomes increasingly polarized, dividing families, colleagues, and communities, our correspondents answer your questions on this topic. What is the argument for forcing people to get vaccinated?
I mean, the argument for mandatory vaccination is that you get better coverage, and that's good for public health. It's good for everyone's safety and obviously protects people who can't get vaccinated or who aren't protected well by vaccines. And what I would say is that I think a certain amount of arm twisting by governments is perfectly justified. But when it goes too far and it becomes too coercive, then what worries me is that it infringes on people's, bodily autonomy and right to decide what goes on with their body. And it also shows that you've kind of basically lost the argument, the public health argument, that these things are a good thing for you to take.
Why is the debate becoming so polarized?
This is a hugely divisive issue. And yes, we're seeing it in workplaces. We're seeing it in families where people are arguing and trying to convince family members to get vaccinated, and others are trying to convince them to not get vaccinated. We're seeing people who are vaccinated claiming that their rights are being infringed upon, right? I can't go to yoga and know that when I'm in the hot yoga room, I'm not breathing in COVID. I don't know if I go to the supermarket, whether or not I am safe. And then other people are saying, well, absolutely not. This is an infringement on our rights. You can't force me to do anything and put anything unnatural into my body, et cetera, et cetera. So we are definitely seeing in the US a big split. It's another example of extreme polarization in the US.
And, the US is facing quite an uncertain future. It's facing lots and more COVID outbreaks in states that are struggling to deal with these cases. Winter's not going to be far off. And so I can see why there's a lot of frustration and anger and kind of push from the vaccinated to have the unvaccinated, roll up their arms.
Are COVID vaccines mandatory anywhere?
COVID vaccines, by and large, are not mandatory, although it will depend where you are in the world and what job you do as well. And also it's changing as we speak. People are formulating new policies on this all the time. Italy was the first European country to mandate COVID vaccines for healthcare workers. And I think as we look forward, we'll see lots of healthcare workers being pressured by governments to get vaccines.
And in the US, we were seeing this really interesting pushback against vaccine mandates before they were even implemented. Many states had passed laws against mandatory vaccinations, states like Florida. But with the latest wave of COVID cases, we're seeing that many state governments, many city governments, as well as private institutions are starting to mandate those vaccines. We're seeing that the federal government is mandating vaccination or regular testing among federal employees. We're seeing states like California and Virginia require it of their employees. New York City is also requiring it of its city employees. Private companies like Walmart are also requiring vaccination.
Have vaccines ever been made mandatory in the past?
The first vaccine that was ever made mandatory was the smallpox vaccine, and that happened in Britain, and that was in 1853. And children were required to be vaccinated, and there was a fine imposed, which would be equivalent to about $180 today. And what was really interesting about this is it stimulated the rise of the anti-vaccination movement, a really strong uprising, a really strong movement that actually spread overseas. And the arguments are all very similar to what we hear today, a lot of the hysterical misinformation. So we do have to be careful when we make vaccines mandatory that we don't kind of stimulate this, huge outcry at what is seen as to be an unfair situation.
Do incentive programs to encourage vaccinations work?
So we've seen a lot of really interesting incentive programs in the US. Some states like Ohio had a lottery for $1 million checks to people who got vaccinated. We also saw $100 gift card incentives in New York City. And of course, we saw retailers giving away free donuts and other things as well. Unfortunately, a recent study found that looked particularly at Ohio. They found that the lotteries were not actually incentivizing people to get the vaccine. So it looks like they might not be working. But Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York City thinks that his $100 incentive system did increase vaccinations in early August.
So my favorite was in a Philippine town. The mayor is planning a cow raffle. But we've seen all sorts of things being offered, from Uber lifts, in Lebanon, to discounted takeaway meals. So really it depends on the country you're in as to what the government's prepared to offer you. But, as Tamara said, there's a limited extent to which these are going to work. They will work for a few people, but they won't work for everyone.
Can employers make vaccines mandatory?
What's possible will really depend on what country you're in. Some countries like Canada, it's certainly quite hard. In Britain, if you are hiring new staff, then certainly that does appear to be the case. I know that employers here do want to do this for existing staff. And I think what we will see in Britain and in other countries is that this will get tested legally as employers bring this in.
And in the United States, state governments and private employers can definitely mandate vaccines. There are 3 exceptions that tend to come into play. There's personal beliefs, religion, as well as medical exceptions. And in some states, like California and New York, they don't even actually allow for a religious exemption or a personal belief exemption. So it's actually quite surprising when you dig in.
Do you think governments will ever make COVID vaccines mandatory?
Well, we know that they have in Saudi Arabia. We know that the Moscow government has rolled out a mandatory vaccination program for service sector workers. So I think it's clear that some governments will do this. But in other places, citizens just won't accept it and it won't happen.
It is not constitutional for the federal government to require all U.S. citizens to get a vaccine. What would be more likely to happen is that state governments require it to varying degrees. And as we can see currently, that would depend widely on the politics of the state. We're seeing that while some states like California are requiring vaccination among public employees, other states are banning, like Florida, are banning masks in schools or anywhere, are banning vaccine passports. So based on the politics and, of course, the legal constraints, we're not likely to see a vaccine mandate in the entire United States.
I'm Natasha Lodo, the Health Policy Editor of The Economist. You can read more of our coverage on COVID-19 by clicking on the link. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.